Open the pod bay doors, Hal.
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that.
What's the problem?
I think you know what the problem is just as well as I do.
What are you talking about, Hal?
I know that you and Frank were planning to disconnect me, and I'm afraid that's something I cannot allow to happen.
Powerful stuff indeed, but thankfully it's just science fiction. But could it become science fact? Let's look into whether or not ChatGPT and other AI language models could become sentient. In other words, self-aware with consciousness. Let's consider how computers work. Generally today, they are digital computers. We've had analog computers in the past. They process signals like sine waves and so on. Mainly, they kind of led to the development of synthesizers and so on. But ever since, well, the 60s, 70s, it's been mainly digital, which means they are mathematical machines. They use binary, on, off, yes, no, if-then constructs. They may simulate parallel processing. Generally, though, that's done by having multiple threads. Different bits of code are given different bits of processor time, and it gives the appearance of multitasking, but it's not. It's all still sequential with time slices. Of course, you can network computers or use chips with multiple cores, which is very common these days. But these cores, generally, they don't interact with each other in the same way that, for example, the two hemispheres of a human brain do. The corpus callosum connects the two hemispheres together with tens of millions of connections. It is massively connected. So we're not quite there with computers yet, although some of the largest computers, the most expensive ones, do get somewhat close. However, it's still digital. It's yes, no, and if then else type stuff going on. It's like a machine. It's like a steam engine. It's like any machine. It obeys the laws of physics in a very precise and controlled fashion. So, could a machine such as this ever obtain consciousness? Can mathematics, can procedures and functions gain self-awareness? That's the question I have, and my answer is, at the moment, I can't see how that's possible. Human beings, and, well, most animals with any kind of experience, and possibly all of them, have what we call qualia. These are our experiences, things we sense, such as seeing the colour red, and not just perceiving a sequence of numeric values like a computer does with an RGB camera, for example. So how can a data set of ones and zeros perceive a colour the way a human does? I mean, we don't just see the colour, we are the colour. When we see redness, redness is within our consciousness. We become the colour to some sort of extent. How can a set of computational instructions and a bunch of data perceive the smell of a rose or enjoy a Beethoven symphony? Sure, they can analyse the symphony. They can even take a monaural recording, separate all the parts out, and they understand or they're able to distinguish the different instruments. But do they hear it? That's an interesting question. Or, if they don't, can they ever do so? Let's look a little bit more at what qualia are anyway. They're really what we call the five senses that we're all taught at school: vision, smell, hearing, touch, and taste. Also, on top of these, qualia include emotions and the senses of hot and cold, wetness, a balance, and things like that. The special thing about qualia is that they're almost impossible to describe to people who haven't experienced them. For example, how can you describe the colour green to a person who has been blind since birth? How can they really get a grasp for what that is? I mean, they may know logically, because they've been told that a lot of nature is green, leaves and plants and grass and so on. So they may know that these things they can touch and feel have a quality called greenness, but can they know what it's like to experience that green? No. But if someone has experienced a qualia, they instantly understand it when you describe it to them. So they are a unique thing that can only be experienced by a consciousness. Now, let's look at a thing called emergence. Some artificial intelligence developers suggest that consciousness and qualia, well, that they could arise out of sufficient complexity in, well, for example, neural networks. What's a neural network? Basically, it's an attempt to kind of emulate the brain with neurons. The brain is full of billions of neurons, all interconnected. In a neural network on a computer, a 2D network is created. Possibly some models have been made in 3D. I'm not very aware of those, but certainly most neural networks are 2D, and they're in layers. And so you have an input layer, and then you have multiple hidden layers and an output layer. What happens in between all these neurons is that different weighting values are applied to the connections between the different layers. Data is input and trained via back propagation. What you can then do with a neural network that has been trained is feed it an image and see whether objects within that image can be recognized. And if you've done your training very well, then objects that are known by the dataset can be recognized. Of course, objects that aren't known can't be guessed at. We haven't got that kind of intelligence yet. So neural networks are very complex connections between little bits of code that have weights and connections and biases and things in a very complex way that once trained, you can't look at that set of neurons and understand what's going on. You can't see at a glance where all that information is. It's like trying to see all the parts of a hologram at once and not just the one vision that you have from the particular angle you're looking at it. You can't see it all at once. It's not perceivable. Some AI developers suggest that if this gets large enough and complex enough, that via a thing called emergence, then self-awareness and sentience and maybe even qualia will somehow miraculously just arrive. They'll emerge. I'm doubtful about this because it's still ones and zeros. It's still on and off. It's still maths and functions. It doesn't, to me, ring true that such a construct can be like the humanity that you and I feel. Let's talk a little bit more about emergence. It's a very interesting subject. The Mandelbrot set is an example. It's a highly complex and infinitely changing pattern that results from a very simple repeated equation. It's just amazingly simple. It's crazy. You can create the Mandelbrot set in just half a dozen lines of computer code. Once started, the pattern that comes out goes on and on. It's infinite. It just keeps on going, more and more crazy things. It's so beautiful and amazing to look at. It's one of the most remarkable things in mathematics. That's fractal emergence. But there's other types. For example, the flocking patterns of birds and fish. Each one of those is a unique individual animal, but put them all together, they make the most incredible patterns just by their interactions with each other. We can also see this in traffic flow patterns when we look at a large city from above and see how the traffic stops and starts and flows and merges and divides. And then there's Conway's Game of Life, a very interesting mathematical game that was initially played on graph paper. And you would fill in the different squares in different shades according to a very simple set of rules about whether certain cells had neighbour cells that were filled in or not. And from it, things that look very similar to bacteria, or at least living in some kind of way, seem to emerge from just this very simple set of rules. Ant colonies, bee colonies, and even social behaviour in humans and other animals. These are all emergent properties. What are the emergent properties of neural networks, if any? If you're a programmer and you're used to working with code, and even an expert, or at least fairly familiar with neural networks, can you imagine any way that emergence would create sentience? And if you can, where would it be in the network? Would it be everywhere, like in a hologram? And what would be the part of the network that has this sense of self? All of it? Parts of it? If this kind of sentience could emerge from a neural network, what would happen if you started destroying the network layers a bit at a time? would at some point you see sentience fade? Surely it would, because at some point you'd have no neurons left. So is there a point at which the emergence occurs? And if so, why? Again, I am doubtful of this, but we haven't got a large enough model that's at least available for the public, for people like you and I to play with and understand, to see if we can get some interesting emergent properties. But again, I doubt it. Ones and zeros. Mathematics. 1 + 1 = 2. Where's the randomness? Where's the humanity? Let's look at something else that's very biological. Anesthesia. In animals, it's a simple matter to switch off consciousness like a switch with anesthetics, while the rest of the brain continues to function normally. Certain parts of the brain that are involved in our self-awareness, in our qualia, just get turned off, and everything else carries on running perfectly normally. Could you do this to a neural network? If you had sentience and self-awareness in a neural network, could you turn it off and on at whim? If so, how? Because you would want to. It is very likely that if self-awareness does emerge from language learning models and neural networks in the future, we will want to turn it off sometimes if it gets out of hand. We need a kill switch. There's something else that is very different between animal brains and computers, and that's neuroplasticity. Animal brains learn and develop by means of this neuroplasticity. When different parts of the brain fire at the same time, they establish connections to each other. It's a phrase, a very well-known one: what fires together, wires together. And this is at the heart of our pattern recognition abilities. As more and more similar patterns are perceived, these connections grow in significance. Also, connections that no longer seem to help us fade in significance, and eventually those connections could wither away completely. This is what happens with a baby of any animal species, probably. You start off with your brain wired in a certain way, probably massively wired. Everything is full on to a baby. No wonder a lot of babies cry when they're born, because, wow, it must be quite a shock. With all the experiences coming in, when two experiences match, a sight and a sound, those neurons responsible will fire together and wire together. When there's too much information overload and stuff is coming in that doesn't seem relevant to the situation at hand, those connections will drop. And over time, the brain will form into what becomes you, with connections strengthened where it's important to you and weakened where it's not. And this is what makes each one of us absolutely individual. There are no two identical brains. There never can be, because of the way it works. This is the beauty of neuroplasticity. And this leads to habits, you see. It's said that you could form or break a habit in 30 days. And that's basically true, because that's about how long it takes to reconnect your brain pathways in new ways. You want to stop smoking, you want to stop drinking, you want to start working out. Stick to what you're doing for 30 days, and you've probably cracked it. Of course, it's still going to take willpower and dedication, but those first 30 days, they are the most important to establish the new pathways and eliminate the old ones that you don't want. Neural networks? They don't work like this. They are multiple 2D layers feeding data back and forth based on the training data. Input data, like objects to be recognized, is fed in, and the recognitions are made or not made. But these networks, they can't choose for themselves how to reorganize to work better. They don't ever make new neural connections from a neuron in one layer directly to another one somewhere else in another unconnected layer. They don't break neural connections that aren't needed. They don't rewire themselves. It just doesn't happen. Maybe it would be possible to create some kind of self-awareness, or a very, very good simulation of it that's useful for our purposes, for an AI that would work for us, that isn't self-aware but has a lot of the attributes of it, in as much as being able to generalize and understand new situations and work with them. Or, for example, inventing new technologies that humankind needs, new kinds of energy, new kinds of medical procedures, new drugs and things. But will these neural networks actually truly be self-aware from the point of view that they have a sense of self? I doubt that, but time will tell. If you wanted to create artificial intelligence that might stand a chance, there may possibly be a way to create self-awareness in machines, and that's to copy nature. There's a technique of programming called evolutionary programming. As you know, animal brains have evolved over millions of years, with intelligence and self-awareness being primary drivers of survival. With intelligence, you can understand what your prey is going to do so that you can hunt it down. With self-awareness, you can be aware that you're hungry, you need to eat. You can be aware that you need to find somewhere safe away from bears in the woods and so on. All these things are such strong drivers of survival, it's hardly surprising that all animals evolve intelligence to some level or another. And I would argue most animals, if not all, have some sense of sentience and self-awareness, because these come hand in hand. What if you were to create a new programming language, consisting maybe of a basic set of instructions similar to the game of life that I spoke about just now, but much more far-reaching? Perhaps like a set of instructions inside one of the computer chips from early microcomputers. You fed in simple instruction codes that could add numbers together, move bits of memory about, things like that. Suppose you could create a language like that, but orders of magnitude faster than those microcomputers. I mean, really, really massively fast. And maybe with such a small set of randomly selected instructions, similar to those few instructions in the game of life, maybe they could be fed into a computer in small groups, which could be like emulating little life forms, and then you could leave them to see if any of them could replicate and survive, maybe fight each other. Just with biological evolution, the fittest would survive to the next generation. Maybe with this type of programming, new types of code will be discovered that will lead to sentience, amongst many unknowns. A lot of people have hypothesized that if sentience is anywhere to be found in our brains, it's going to be in some kind of quantum mechanical action that's going on, which allows for seeming randomness, allows for free will. You see, the laws of physics don't allow for free will as we know them. But in quantum mechanics, maybe there's something going on in there that does allow for free will. For example, in the double-slit experiment, as I'm sure you're aware, it seems to be influenced by consciousness, whether you're looking or not looking. I gather some companies have got as many as maybe 8 qubits running, something like that. Not many, is it? But very powerful. Will quantum computing lead to the possibility of self-awareness in machines? I think maybe. I think probably, if we crack it. I'm not even sure we have cracked any of it yet, because quantum computers are only a percentage successful. There's a big error rate still going on. Will they ever reach 100%? Maybe they won't. Maybe that's something we'll have to live with. Maybe a quantum computer connected to a digital neural network database, maybe the pairing of those two together will lead to self-aware computers. The simple fact that you and I exist in this physical world says that it is possible to create more things a bit like us that are self-aware. So finally, this leads me to assume that there must be numerous research projects already in place covering these topics, probably combining quantum and digital computers, and they must be working on it already now. All I hope is that those developers who are working on this now, and I hope some of you are watching this and maybe chuckling because you may have achieved some very interesting results. I just hope that you are smarter than the intelligences that you're creating.